This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Zimbabwe sends high-powered team to fight for reversal of Ivory sales ban. African leaders push G7 nations for more support to fight militants in West Africa. And G7 nations pledge $22 million to help fight Amazon fires. Hello and welcome to Africa Live, only on CGTN. I'm Karen Roberts, live in Nairobi. Rama joins me now with all your business headlines.
Thank you very much, Karen. Here's what's coming up in business. Kenya formally joins the ranks of oil exporting nations. And Sudan is looking for $8 billion in emergency aid to stimulate its ailing economy. We'll have the details on those stories and lots more coming your way in the course of the hour. For now, though, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Karen.
Thank you, Rama. We begin in France, where G7 leaders have been answering questions. French President Emmanuel Macron urged Iran to stay committed to the 2015 nuclear deal. This a day after Iran's foreign minister made a surprise visit to Biarritz, the seaside town where the G7 took place. Macron said that he hoped for a meeting in the coming weeks between US President Donald Trump and Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. The G7 nations also pledged 20 million euros to help in fighting the Amazon fires.
This morning, President Rouhani said that he was prepared to meet any political leader who in the interest of his country. And that's what I told Minister Zarif. And this is what I mentioned to President Rouhani on the phone as well, that if he agreed to a meeting with President Trump, that my conviction was that an agreement can be met. We know the terms, we know the objectives, but we have to just now sit around the table and make that happen. So I hope that in the next few weeks, based on our discussions, we will be able to achieve the meeting that we just mentioned between President Rouhani and President Trump.
If the circumstances were correct or the right, I would certainly agree to that. But in the meantime, they have to be good players. You understand what that means. And they can't do what they were saying they're going to do, because if they do that, they're going to be met with really very violent force. We have no choice.
We've also spoken in Biarritz about the biggest global challenges confronting us all today, and these are things that I think also matter very much to the people in the UK. We've been talking about biodiversity. We've got to stop the tragic loss of habitats and species that is happening around the world. We can't just sit back as animals and plants are wiped off the face of the planet.
Well, earlier we spoke to Herman Pretorius, an analyst at International Race Relations in Johannesburg, on the just concluded G7 summit and its likely impact on the African continent.
What we saw today, in the discussion today especially, was President Ramaphosa from South Africa trying to promote investment in Africa by promoting or focusing attention on the free trade area that has recently come into force in 55 African countries. So from a general economic perspective, the best thing that African leaders can hope for is assistance in establishing this free trade area. Africa can benefit a lot from this free trade area, but there is still some way to go in terms of infrastructure development, access to European markets, access to cheaper technology. All these things would be able to help Africa as a continent, and I'm sure that the African leaders at the G7 summit will be very interested in what the G7 countries can offer, especially with regards to manufacturing and agricultural products that Africa can export past existing trade barriers to ensure that trade relationships and economic development can really drive this African free trade agreement forward. The problem is, as you say yourself, this call is not a new one. The world is currently in a state of some turmoil, and unfortunately, I don't think too much can be expected to come from this G7 summit. In terms of security, Africa is a hotbed for a spillover from the Middle East, with the military action perhaps in certain parts there being successful. So with regards to safety and security concerns, even though these concerns are quite pressing, I fail to see how much more can be achieved through the summit if that which had been previously been attempted has not been successfully achieved, so as to improve security and general safety of things like infrastructure, basic citizen interaction. These things need to be stepped up, and it is difficult to see what the G7 nations can do in this regard.
To Sudan now, where the newly formed Sovereign Council has declared a state of emergency in Port Sudan. This comes after tribal clashes left at least 16 people dead. That's according to security officials. Tensions between the Beni Amr and Nuba tribes reignited on Wednesday and continued into Saturday morning. This incident comes at a delicate time in Sudan's transition. A power-sharing deal was signed earlier this month, while the Joint Military-Civilian Sovereign Council was sworn in only last week. Port Sudan is the country's main sea gateway and is also used by neighbouring landlocked South Sudan to export oil. The council has reportedly dismissed 2 regional officials from the Red Sea state, of which Port Sudan is the capital.
ويشدد مجلس السيادة الانتقالي.
The Sovereign Council announces its decision to relieve the acting governor of the state of the Red Sea of his duties and assign instead a governor who is able to operate under the rules of law, security, and the dignity of the state. The council has also decided to relieve the state's head of National Security Service of his duties. The council emphasizes that the state of emergency is in action and that an investigation committee has been formed to investigate the facts and ensure that damages are being accounted for.
As part of strengthening military cooperation, Air Force chiefs from across Africa are meeting in Nairobi to address key challenges facing African airmen. The event, the first to be hosted in Kenya, includes the United States Air Force team, whose main focus is African airspace. CGTN's Daniel Arapmoy has more.
38 air chiefs from across Africa in Kenya to discuss important continental issues, build relationships, and create solutions to their most pressing challenges as airmen. The delegates meeting in the Kenyan capital Nairobi acknowledged the changing nature of warfare within the African continent, calling for a collective effort to tackle the challenges.
Together, we stand shoulder to shoulder to assist each other in bringing stability and security to the region.
With numerous violent extremist organizations infiltrating the continent, Africa relies on these chiefs representing the air domain to provide the hold force to whatever violent extremist organization intending to destabilize the sovereignty of nations of African countries.
As you are aware, terrorism affects all countries, and it is only through collaborating between different countries, working together, sharing of information, that we are able to counter terror.
In effort to ensure the air chiefs are prepared to address ever-changing and new threats in their countries, this year's conference is focused on identifying policies, institutional challenges that confront the African airmen. One of the major concerns raised by delegates is the question of unmanned aerial vehicles, whose use, they say, is not regulated in many cases, thus posing fundamental security threat on the African continent.
We asked that they be withdrawn because certain aspects had not been addressed. That has been addressed, and within the next few weeks, we'll have regulations in place. As it is right now, flying of UAV, unless it is for security reasons, is prohibited.
The Multinational Security Cooperation Initiative that brings together Air Force chiefs is meant to foster more effective military relations in Africa. Daniel Arapmoy, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
5 weeks after members of the army were deployed to assist the South African police fight crime in townships around Cape Town, the local community is starting to question the impact of the National Defence Force deployment. Religious leaders have now also added their voice to the call for an end to the violence and gang-related killings in townships around Cape Town.
Members of the community and religious leaders from a variety of faiths took to the streets to call for an end to the ongoing violence. This came after a 7-year-old girl was shot dead and after a 41-year-old soldier deployed in the fight against crime was found burnt to death in the trunk of a car a few days ago.
The purpose of this event is to tell the world that communities of the Cape Flats from all of these different areas have decided that we have come together to take initiatives into our own hands, to say to the world that we have had enough of crime and violence and of destruction.
The community basically and all the religious leaders gathered saying to the government and to the gangsters and the people who's causing the violence that enough is enough.
The religious leaders are urging gangsters to stop the killing of their own communities and are calling on the government and the South African Police Service to sit down with chosen community leaders to try and find a way to stop the carnage. They are adamant that bringing in the army to help the police is not the answer.
Sending in the army is not a solution. It is at best a very short-term solution. Armies do not exist to come and control communities. Crime control in community is the job of the police. The army is necessary when somebody attacks our borders. But we do not really want to see people with semi-automatic weapons patrolling our streets.
Everywhere they are crying, children are being killed, families lose dear ones and near ones, and therefore we say enough is enough. We need peace, we need love, and we need social coexistence with everyone.
The interfaith religious leaders say they will continue to work for peace, justice, freedom and dignity for the crime-ravaged communities in and around Cape Town, the same way they had fought to liberate apartheid South Africa in the 80s and 90s. Renad Al-Kham, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
The Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo has announced a new government, with many officials joining the executive for the first time. The announcement comes 7 months after the inauguration of President Felix Tshisekedi. CGTN's Chris Ochemringa has more from Kinshasa.
Prime Minister Sylvester Ilunkamba says the new coalition government has been endorsed by President Felix Tshisekedi. The government is composed of 42 members from former President Joseph Kabila's coalition and 23 from President Tshisekedi's. About 3/4 of the members in the government will be serving for the first time. The executive will have a female vice prime minister, a minister of foreign affairs, and a minister of planning. The formation of the new government has taken months because of disagreements over the appointment of members to key institutions. President Tshisekedi and his predecessor entered a power-sharing agreement in March this year after Kabila's coalition won a parliamentary majority. The move was aimed at enabling President Tshisekedi to have more influence in running the government. The new government is expected to start work soon. Some of the tasks they are faced with include rebuilding institutions, ending conflict in the East, and renewing trust in the government. Chris Ochamringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
A high-powered delegation from Zimbabwe has joined fellow Southern African Development Community delegates in Geneva to fight for the reversal of the ban on the sale of ivory. At the ongoing CITES conference, SADC members are seeking permission for countries with high elephant populations to use management methods, including trophy hunting, culling, and the sale of ivory.
Southern African nations are fortifying their call for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species to lift the 1990 ban on ivory trade. Some countries in the region, which are struggling to maintain the huge elephant population in a sustainable way, want the collective voices heard. Several Southern African nations comprised of Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe and South Africa host 50% of Africa's elephant population. Zimbabwe hosts a population of more than 84,000 elephants against a carrying capacity of 40,000. Zimbabwe comes only second to Botswana, which hosts a herd of 130,000. Zimbabwe is sitting on rhino and ivory horn stockpiles worth $600 million following the 1990 CITES ban on hunting and trading of such products. President Emmerson Mnangagwa recently said the ban was depriving his country of financial resources that could be used to support conservation of wildlife and natural resources for the next 20 years. Zimbabwe has also documented existing challenges emerging from the growing human-wildlife population. About 200 people have died from elephant attacks in the past 5 years. And of all wildlife attacks, it is estimated 40% of the cases involved elephants encroaching on human habitats in search of water. In addition, Zimbabwe has reported that farmers living near conservation areas have lost more than 17,000 acres of crops on straying elephants and hardly benefit from the reward of hosting the precious wildlife. These are realities shared by the greater African continent. For the 32 countries from Africa championing for the ban to be upheld, a pestering shared reality informs their stance. Between 30 to 50 elephants are still being poached every day to supply ivory to traffickers, and the African elephant population continues to fall from an estimated 12 million a century ago to the current 400,000. With this reality, the fight to have the ban lifted remains an uphill task, especially with Western countries lobbying to have it maintained. And although all countries agree the world's largest land animal needs greater protection, the main challenge is how to balance protection while maximizing profit. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
We're going to a short break now, lots more to come, including Egyptian government moving out of Cairo to turn it into a tourist city. And Africa on the verge of being declared polio-free. But what about malaria and cancer?
Africa Live. Find your voice.
This week, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi ordered Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli to relocate Cairo's ministries and state administrative headquarters by 2020. It's part of a state plan to develop the historic city. In a statement released by Egypt's cabinet, Madbouli said there is a presidential mandate to develop Cairo by moving governmental ministries to the new administrative capital. The idea is to turn Cairo into a historical, cultural and tourist city. Yasser Hakim has more.
He is a government employee who had been serving the state for years. Like tens of thousands of similar cases, he will be relocated into the new administrative capital east of Cairo in 2020.
I approve the idea so we can live in a calmer environment with better facilities, especially if we are provided with housing units by the government close to the new offices. This will save a lot of headache with transportation, schools and daily errands for my family in the administrative capital.
Though he will have to leave behind his relatives, longtime neighbors and friends, he believes it could be a positive transition.
It's definitely going to be better than where we live in Cairo now because it's new, developed with modern schools and streets. These are better living conditions overall.
Government ministries are expected to move out, in addition to parliament, presidency and diplomatic missions.
The aim is to free up the massively overpopulated capital. Modern Cairo has been developed more than a century ago to host around 5 or 6 million people. But now there are over 20 million living there.
In its first stage, the government targets 30% of Cairo residents to relocate into the high-tech, futuristic, smart administrative capital.
You have the modern buildings, the highly advanced technological infrastructure placed in the city. There is also a green river passing through the city, creating environmental friendly surroundings. You're building a new community with a new vision, and it's linked by all modes of transportation with the rest of the country.
But what will become of the old capital, Cairo?
The plans are to restore Cairo to its original beauty as a cultural, historical and touristic destination. Downtown Cairo, for example, will have a major facelift to renovate all the historic buildings, roads and alleys. Cairo will restore its famous image of the past.
It's an ambitious project that could cost over $45 billion. But the government is adamant this will create a better future for the coming generations. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres is set to travel to the Democratic Republic of Congo next week in a bid to tackle the worst Ebola epidemic the country has faced in 40 years. The World Health Organization puts the number of confirmed cases at 2,800, with at least 1,900 deaths from the disease. CGTN's Chris Ochemringa has more from Kinshasa.
The UN chief is expected to arrive in the DRC on the 31st of August for a 3-day visit. He's scheduled to visit an Ebola hotspot in eastern DRC to meet with survivors and health workers who've been battling the disease. In June this year, the UN Secretary General launched a dedicated Ebola task force led by David Gressley to coordinate the international community's response in North Kivu and Ituri provinces. This followed an increase in attacks on health workers and facilities by armed groups in the east. Security in the region has since been reinforced. The UN scaled up its Ebola prevention strategy after the World Health Organization declared the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern. More than 200,000 people have been vaccinated since the start of August last year. But the disease has killed close to 2,000 people within the same period. Health experts say they're optimistic about ending the outbreak after 2 drugs were recently found to be effective in treating Ebola. Chris Ochemringa, CGTN, Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo.
In Somalia, health officials are conducting a nationwide campaign to keep polio at bay. CGTN's Abdulaziz Billo reports now from Mogadishu.
Vaccination teams are touring populated areas including markets in efforts to provide oral vaccine against poliovirus in a nationwide campaign aimed at eradicating the disease. The country has been successful in containing the poliovirus against the backdrop of widespread conflict, massive displacement and lack of basic health infrastructure in parts of the country. In 2017, the United Nations Children's Agency UNICEF declared Somalia polio-free. This is after health officials vaccinated more than 2 million children under the age of 5.
The importance of early vaccination is to prevent victims from becoming paralyzed. It weakens parts of the body, mainly the hands and legs. Those who received the vaccine can be able to handle any threats to their immune system, and that's why early vaccination is the best option.
Currently, with support from the United Nations, Mogadishu has rolled out a new vaccination drive targeting close to 1 million children after several cases were detected in the relatively stable regions of Puntland and Somaliland, north of the country. Health experts, however, warn that children in militant-controlled areas face much greater risk of contracting the virus, as health campaigners cannot travel to regions due to Al-Shabaab's threat. The Al-Qaeda-linked group has banned health agencies from vaccinating children in areas under its control, a concern the government says is being addressed by dislodging the group from south and central regions of the country.
The government, through the Ministry of Health and UN agencies, have tried for years to vaccinate against such viruses. But conflict continues to prevent medical assistance from reaching children in areas not under governmental control. Children in such areas face much greater risk and must receive prevention vaccines.
In July, the Somali government and UNICEF launched a major campaign in the Puntland and Somaliland regions after authorities there detected 2 strains of polio virus that requires different vaccines to create immunity among thousands of children. The government hopes to target nomadic communities in both areas, but climate change continues to displace families that in turn disrupts vaccination drives. A cycle of drought in the region has also forced children out of schools as they are forced to move with their parents to seek pasture and water for their livestock. Abdulaziz Bilo, CGTN, Mogadishu, Somalia.
Well, Africa is on the verge of being declared polio-free as Nigeria marks 3 years free of the endemic wild polio virus. It's welcome news, but more needs to be done to eradicate other diseases such as malaria, a constant challenge for the continent. CGTN's Robert Nagila now reports.
The countdown has begun. The World Health Organization says no wild polio virus has been detected on the African continent in the last 3 years. Africa is now expected to be certified free of wild polio by 2020, a significant milestone in the quest to eradicate the disease. But other diseases still pose a major challenge. Africa shoulders 90% of the global malaria burden. The World Health Organization says in the 10 African countries hardest hit by malaria, there were 3.5 million more cases in 2017 compared to the previous year. To end malaria, the African Union Commission and partner organizations are promoting a grassroots campaign called Zero Malaria Starts With Me that aims to keep malaria high on the political agenda, mobilize additional resources and empower communities. Another disease that continues to pose a great challenge is cancer. Africa accounted for 7.3% of the 9.6 million deaths from cancer in 2018. According to Dr. Chris Wild from IARC, efficient prevention and early detection policies must be implemented urgently to complement treatments in order to control this devastating disease across the world.
Well, now here's Rama with all the business news for you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Here's what's coming up in business. Kenya has formally started to export its oil reserves. And Sudan is looking for $8 billion in emergency aid to stimulate its ailing economy.
Nigeria is my home. 160 million vibrant, ambitious individuals constantly seeking the perfect self-expression. It is these people who inspired me to be that person that is seen, to be a voice that is heard, and ultimately to be the anchor that I am. I have to tap in, tune in, and turn on the very best qualities within me to deliver the news. I'm Richard Nta, an anchor for CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. Kenya has formally joined the League of Oil Exporting Nations. President Uhuru Kenyatta flagged off its inaugural crude shipment from the port of Mombasa. A Chinese firm, ChemChina, has bought the first batch of about 200,000 barrels of crude at about $12 million in total. Now, the experimental phase is forecast to earn the country about $84 million over a 2-year period, selling at an average price of $60 a barrel. Kenya's journey to become an oil exporter started way back in 2012. This is after the oil and gas explorer, Tullow Oil, discovered commercial oil reserves in the Lokichar Basin in the northwest of the country. Since 2018, Tullow Oil has been running a pilot scheme transporting some 2,000 barrels of oil per day by trucks to Mombasa from the oil fields over in Turkana.
Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, I'm proud to say Kenya's grand march to oil and gas production and export has now begun. The flagging off of this maiden assignment represents a new dawn, not just for Kenya, but also for our region, and the beginning of a new era of greater prosperity for all Kenyans. This greater prosperity must, however, be jealously protected. And in this regard, I wish to underscore the government's unshakable commitment to sustainable development. We will ensure that Kenya's natural resources are utilized in a manner that yields maximum dividends today, but without compromising the interests of future generations.
Sudan's new Prime Minister has opened talks with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as part of efforts to revive that country's economy. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has said that Sudan needs up to $8 billion in the next 3 months in order to halt a decline in the country's currency. Hamdok used to run the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and he wants to restructure Sudan's debt with the World Bank and the IMF. The breakaway of South Sudan in 2011 meant that Sudan lost much of the revenue from oil production. Its currency has also spiraled in devaluation. US sanctions, which have been in place since 1993, have also pushed Sudan to economic isolation. In April, mounting public anger with shortages of food, fuel and hard currency triggered mass demonstrations that eventually forced then-President Omar Hassan al-Bashir from power. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have pledged to provide $3 billion in aid to Sudan. On to Southern Africa now. Zambia has introduced a cap on the price of maize in order to keep the staple food affordable. The Zambia National Farmers Union, however, which represents commercial farmers, has, however, condemned this price cap. The union wants prices to be left purely to market forces. Agriculture Minister Michael Katambo said that a meeting with millers, stock feed manufacturers and grain traders agreed to peg the price of maize to a maximum of $198 a tonne. The price of maize meal, which is Zambia's staple food, has in some cases doubled earlier this year. This has been attributed to a general decline in maize output. Maize production fell by 16% to 2 million tonnes from 2.3 million last year. Farmers have blamed prolonged dry weather for the fall in maize production. Back to East Africa now. Banks and financial institutions in Tanzania risk hefty fines unless they set up local data centres in 3 months. Tanzania's central bank has warned that the institutions that fail to comply will be fined up to $2 million. The central bank wants the banks to relocate their data from servers abroad. Now, the regulator has in the recent past enhanced its oversight over banks. Local banks have been hit by a spike in bad loans, which have stifled the growth of credit to the private sector. In December, the International Monetary Fund warned that nearly half of Tanzania's 45 banks were vulnerable to adverse shocks and risked being insolvent. So far, 9 banks have had their licenses withdrawn by Tanzania's central bank. On to matters further afield now. The American tech giant Apple shed $44 billion in market value on Friday after pronouncements from Beijing and Washington cast a spotlight on its enormous Chinese production base. Now, for investors, the firm's reliance on China is looking increasingly like its biggest handicap, as almost all of the world's iPhones are actually made there. Apple's main assembly partner, Foxconn, says it has the capacity to build all of the company's US-bound iPhones outside China, but it would require much more time and money. The US President Donald Trump this weekend ordered, in quotes, American companies to immediately start looking for alternatives to manufacturing in China. In the meantime, authorities in Beijing say they will not buy the US approach of threats and intimidation in trade talks, and they warn they will absolutely retaliate if the US puts extra tariffs on Chinese goods. Just last week, the US president ordered, as I mentioned, in quotes, American companies to start looking for an alternative to production in China. Later on Sunday, Mr. Trump and his top aides downplayed the idea of pushing US firms to abandon China altogether. Speaking on the sidelines of a G7 summit on Monday, Mr. Trump claimed that Beijing had offered to get back to the negotiating table and to make a trade deal, even though Beijing has not confirmed that yet. China has also warned that forcing American companies to break up with the Chinese partners will damage industrial chains.
This sounds like a political slogan for the US to call on its companies to withdraw from China. It is not a practical measure. Even if it did take place, there would be someone else to fill in, and eventually it would be the US to suffer the damage.
The US President Donald Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe have agreed on the principles of a trade deal that would probably be signed next month in New York. Trump's trade representative Robert Lighthizer said the deal would open up markets to over $7 billion worth of goods and covered agriculture, industrial tariffs and digital trade too. The Prime Minister agreed that Japan would buy excess American corn. He said that the potential purchases would be carried out by the private sector.
First of all, what we have is an agreement on core principles. It has three parts: agriculture, industrial tariffs, and digital trade. And from our point of view, it is extremely important for our farmers and ranchers and those people who work in the digital space. We'll get into the details at another time, but generally, Japan is our third largest agricultural market. They import about $14 billion worth of U.S. agricultural products, and this will open up markets to over $7 billion of those products.
Now, the French capital is the third most visited city on the planet. 50 million tourists made the trip there last year, but Paris has had enough of some forms of tourism, especially large groups and tour buses, and want to restrict them from its centre. CGTN's Elena Cassas reports from the French capital.
The city of love is on every traveller's bucket list, but Parisians haven't always been the best at welcoming them.
They are not so service-oriented, so sometimes even they are quite rude, you know. So far it's not so. It hasn't been so comfortable when you are in a restaurant or those kind of things.
We were trying to ask where to go, what way to go. No one would have anything to do with us. They wouldn't help out. All they did was speak French, and we tried to say we were English and didn't understand, and they weren't helpful at all. They were very rude.
We're finding them fantastic. We're staying in a lovely hotel. When we arrived yesterday, they couldn't have been more helpful. We came into Montmartre yesterday, went to a couple of places for coffee. Everyone was lovely, really friendly.
Now it's the mayor's office accused of being unwelcoming, following a crackdown on Airbnb with a law limiting short-term lets to 120 nights a year. It's tour buses that are in City Hall's sites. There are 4 hop-on, hop-off tour bus companies like this operating in Paris at the moment, taking tens of thousands of tourists every year. But City Hall says they clog the traffic, pollute the air and use too many parking spaces. They want to encourage tourists to use public transport, walk or cycle instead. Showing tourists the sights from a double-decker is set to get tougher. Bus companies have until September the 10th to prove their fleet will be using 100% clean energy by 2024, or they'll lose their licence to operate. The new rules also cut the numbers allowed to 36 buses per firm, something the companies say is unfair.
Our clients, like a lot of tourists in Paris, are older, not young people going partying. And these older people, or those with reduced mobility, can't use public transport. So you have to realise this is a need tourists have everywhere, and it would be illogical if one of our most touristed cities in the world didn't have this popular service.
According to the city's own figures, only 8% of visitors went on any organised tour last year, so a crackdown on buses shouldn't hit Paris's $23.8 billion in annual earnings from tourism too hard. Guides say they're particularly popular with certain nationalities, like the Chinese, but with or without the double-deckers, the City of Light is likely to keep drawing the crowds. Elena Cassas, CGTN, Paris.
And in South Africa, the idea of a lack of facilities for childcare in the office is all too familiar. But some companies are finding ways around it. This comes as they try to make the office a lot more conducive for new parents. With the details, here's CGTN's Sumitra Naidu.
South Africa has a thriving private sector. The government has a ministry dedicated to women and children. Yet women are still feeling marginalized. I found only a handful of companies that provide office childcare for their employees. Green School in Cape Town is dedicated to the employees of Old Mutual.
So Old Mutual Green School was launched in 2008. We opened on the 1st of April. The reason being is that we needed good daycare facility and in close proximity to the head office where the parents were working.
Being a new parent can be a challenge, but knowing that there is a place that can take care of your child just as much as you can is reassuring.
There's a textbook way of learning what you need to and how you need to care for your child, and then you have to think of bringing him to a school, and you wonder if that is going to be the same way that the care is applied to your child. But I think the comfort comes in when you've seen how they treat your child when you drop them off, when you pick them up, the facilities of the school, the security of the school. So the transition made it easier, and I felt much at ease from maternity leave going to work, knowing that my child is in a safe, secure and caring environment.
Companies that provide creche services find their female staff are happier and more productive.
I find that more moms are getting back to work sooner. Their babies are 3 months old and they will be back at work because they know they have a safe space to leave their child. Also, that their child is 2 minutes away from the head office, so they can walk over at any time just to come and visit their baby or to breastfeed their baby.
My experience has been great at Green School since day one. There was no need for me to check up on him. Oh, there's numerous of benefits, just the convenience of it. I'm not worried about a thing. I am so relaxed just being at work. They have in-house nurses, the staff is incredible. They have loads of activities. I know that in every aspect of his development, he's being catered for. So I'm happy, 100% happy.
Good quality childcare is essential for proper development, but it's expensive. Often women are forced to leave their children with family and in some cases choose not to work and stay home. Sumitra Nadu, CGT in Johannesburg, South Africa.
I'll leave you there for the time being. I'll be back at the top of the hour. We'll be going to South Africa at that point in time. Might we be looking at a looming taxpayer revolt? After all the years of corruption and falling revenues, that might certainly be the case. We'll examine that in a lot more detail, live from Johannesburg at 1800 GMT. See you then. For now, though, back to you.
Thank you very much, Brahma. We are going to a break. Don't go away. Lots more to come, including art competition winner in South Africa sheds light on country's power outages.
When you look at Africa, what do you really see? Do you see fast-growing, endless deserts and parched earth? Or do you see the biggest opportunity for an agricultural revolution in a generation? Do you see crowded, unplanned cities or vast, untapped markets? Do you see a population at risk, or do you see a billion-strong opportunity to grow the next wave of multi-billion-dollar firms in Africa? When you look at Africa, what do you really see? Join us in Global Business and see Africa through our eyes.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
One of South Africa's oldest and prestigious art competitions has seen a return to traditional art in recent years. The Sasol New Signatures competition has played an integral role in showcasing young talent over the last 30 years. This year's winner, Patrick Relore, sheds light on how crippling power shortages affect everyday life. CGTN's Julie Shear has more.
Patrick Rouleau's oil and acrylic painting titled Stage 4 Moments claimed top spot from 100 finalists in the Sasol New Signatures competition. The fine arts student depicts life during South Africa's power crisis.
I felt compelled to do this piece because I've seen how this extreme shortage of electricity has affected South Africa, and particularly my family, because this one is not something that in my family we do complain about, but it brings value because we really get together and make quality times out of these dark moments.
This is the 2019 winner, and he walks away with almost $7,000 and a chance to showcase in a solo exhibition next year.
It's such an overwhelming experience, and I've just seen that it is possible when you really, work hard as a person. But it's such an inspirational, I think, for my friends and my colleagues. So I've seen that it's possible.
Rouleau's work displayed a common thread of pressing societal issues in this year's submissions, all of which will be published in the annual catalogue.
The catalogue becomes a very, very important marketing tool because it is seen as one of the creme de la creme competitions in the country. And we've seen over the past couple of years that there's been keen interest from international investors, art schools and institutions that are offering residencies to our finalists.
Last year's winner, Jessica Kapp, presented her solo exhibition on the 2017 Knysna fires.
Not being there, it was a very disconcerted feeling, hearing that you might, potentially lose your home, lose part of your identity. Or for me, home has become a very big part of my identity. So this exhibition focuses on land, focuses on possession and human experience, but also looks at space and place.
Cecil's art initiative has sculpted the careers of many artists over the last 30 years. It also shows that classic art has not lost its appeal in an age where digital forms are becoming popular. Julie Shara, CGTN, Pretoria, South Africa.
After the break, all the sports coming up for you, including... We bring you the latest from day 8 at the 2019 African Games in Rabat in Morocco.
Africa, where champions are made, records are broken, legends are born. We're there for every goal, for every knockout, for every step of the way. Match Point, only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Day 8 of the African Games will see the start of track and field events take place at the Moulay Abdallah Stadium in Rabat. Track and field is one of the 26 disciplines at the Games.